This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, promoting humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin, speaking to you from Washington, D.C. today. Every week, Gilad and I, together or separately, talk to authors about books and research and things that have caught our attention. As always, you can, of course, support us by going to tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and clicking on the Patreon button to support us, or go to patreon.com/Tel Aviv Review. Even a little goes a long way. Our guest today is Khaled Elgindy. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute. He's an adjunct instructor at Georgetown University, and he previously served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on peace negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009, and he was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations in 2008. Today we'll be talking about his latest book. It's called Blind Spot: America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump, published by the Brookings Institute Press in 2019. Khaled, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dahlia.
One of the many notable things about this book is the title, Blind Spot. It makes a pretty strong statement, and you identify a couple of very specific blind spots that form your thesis of the book. What are you referring to when you talk about a blind spot in U.S. policy towards Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, what I'm referring to is kind of this consistent, almost chronic inability on the part of the United States to take into account two things in terms of its role as a mediator. The first is the enormous power disparity between the two sides. Clearly, that is a factor that helps to drive the conflict and has to be part of the negotiations and negotiating process in general. And the other aspect that American policymakers typically downplay or completely ignore is internal Palestinian politics, very much in contrast to the enormous deference that is shown to Israeli politics, for example. And so
almost obsession sometimes.
Almost obsession, right. And you can, it's even now, right, the American policymakers who are commenting on the drama of internal Israeli politics. There's probably as many American analysts commenting on it as Israelis. It is pretty significant. And it should be, because, in any negotiating process, in any peace process, the conditions outside of the negotiations are as important as whatever is happening inside. And so there are constraints on the parties, whether they're internal or external constraints. And one of them is the internal politics. Every negotiator goes in with their political opposition kind of looking over their shoulders.
Why are these two factors so damaging to America's leadership in the process? I mean, you just pointed out one of the reasons why inattention to Palestinian politics is so damaging. Why is the first factor, the fundamental inequality between the two parties, such a burden on the peace process? Yeah,
because, there's a tendency, I think, on the part of American policymakers to treat the two sides as co-equal parties. There's a conflict, very similar perhaps to the way the Americans looked at the Egypt-Israel negotiations, or, say, Syria-Israel negotiations that happened in the past. But the reality, of course, is very different, because it's not just a conflict. It's also an occupation. And one side is actually occupying the other side. And, one of the very dramatic manifestations of that is something that I witnessed firsthand, and a lot of us watched on TV, which was, I arrived in Ramallah for this position as a negotiations advisor in 2004. And at that time, the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat, was still holed up in the Muqata in his presidential compound, surrounded by Israeli tanks, which had basically destroyed most of that compound. That's a dynamic that doesn't exist in a lot of other bilateral negotiations, where one side has the ability to besiege the leader of the other side. So clearly power dynamics matter a great deal. And what we've seen consistently is an American-led process that prefers to not push back on Israeli power, particularly in terms of Israeli occupation, whether it's Israel's use of excessive military force or whether it's the settlement project that various Israeli governments have pursued, there's a real reluctance to push back on those because, presumably, there is a political cost to pay. So it's much easier to simply elide those issues and focus on other issues like Palestinian institutions or the economics of the situation, and kind of, they end up sort of dabbling in the margins rather than tackling the core issues that drive the conflict.
Okay. One of the other themes that I think comes out as a very important theme in the book, that is an insightful theme in the book, that is not actually one of these two blind spots, is this historic American ambiguity and dissonance between its own stated policy and what it actually does with relation to Israel, which goes way back even to, the years of Truman. I mean, would you be able to give us some examples of this and why it's also kind of weighing on the process?
Yeah, I mean, that you touched on one of the threads. One of the things that I wanted to do in this book and why I look at this whole historical period of a century is to try to discern the common threads that run through every period. And the one that you touched on, American ambivalence, is certainly one of them. It's always been the case that there's been this gap between official U.S. policy on the one hand and the actual policies pursued on the ground on the other. And it goes back to Balfour, even during the British Mandate, where officially the United States was neutral, but in reality, both the president and the Congress had come down pretty firmly in favor of the creation of a Jewish national home, even though they were, the official position was that this is a British internal matter, we don't have any opinion, and they didn't want to kind of alienate the rest of the region. That same ambivalence we saw during Truman, and I think Truman was the most extreme personification of this ambivalence because he was constantly flip-flopping his position. The State Department was against the idea of partition, and so that was also his position, but then he started, for domestic political reasons, started reassuring members of the Jewish community that he actually did favor partition.
Then you say at a certain point that he wasn't really for a Jewish state in the sense that he wasn't even for a Catholic or a
right.
Some
exactly.
other kind of
Yeah. So
he had his own internal
personal
problems.
Right. He had his own kind of personal philosophical problems with the idea of a Jewish state. But from a political standpoint, he wanted to make it clear to the Jewish community that he was in favor.
And he eventually did kind of become politically convinced.
And he did become politically convinced, and he ordered, for example, one of the first things he did after Israel declared its independence was to recognize, he was the first foreign country to recognize Israel's independence, very much to the shock and horror of the State Department, and it created a crisis there. But then immediately after that, kind of reversed his position again when he saw the outbreak of violence that had been triggered by the partition vote at the UN, and sort of backed away from partition in favor of this other State Department idea of a UN trusteeship, which would basically allow the UN to continue to administer the area of Palestine, but as a binational state. And so that was really where the foreign service officers, the bulk of the foreign policy and intelligence establishment were. But that was the most extreme version of this ambivalence. But we've seen it over and over again where, as recent as the George W. Bush administration with something like the roadmap. The roadmap was this peace plan put forward by the United States, Russia, the EU, and the UN, and it was actually authored primarily by the United States. This was an American-driven initiative. But then as soon as the roadmap was issued, the Bush administration was the first to abandon it. And because the roadmap contained things like a total settlement freeze, things that would have been unacceptable to the Israelis. And so there's this gap, and sometimes the gap is bigger than other times. But during the Bush administration, it was almost schizophrenic, the positions that would be staked out. They were in complete conflict with one another.
I can't help it. I'm a comparativist. Listeners know that I love bringing in other examples. And when I thought about this thread of the ambiguity, I thought, I'm not sure if I'm convinced, right? How consistent is American policy or any country's foreign policy with any other conflict, especially when they're ongoing and complicated? But once I, read your many examples, I kind of couldn't get out of my mind. It does seem to explain a lot. And I guess my question is, do you think this is a particular ambiguity that America has relative to this conflict? Is there something special? Like, is it a deeper and more troubled ambiguity? And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the idea that there's a gap between official positions and the policies that the U.S. pursues on the ground, that's not new. I mean, of course, that applies in a lot of cases. There's always an ideal and then a reality, and there's very often a gap between them. But I think what is different in this case is the severity and depth of that ambivalence and that gap, as where you have almost a kind of schizophrenia in terms of pushing one position and its opposite at the same time. And that's sometimes because there are different factions within the administration pulling in opposing directions.
Sometimes even individuals.
Sometimes
different administrations, as you document in the book.
Right. And so, but it's clear I think the source of that ambivalence is fairly consistent and fairly clear, which is, on the one hand, to oversimplify, but on the one hand, there is the foreign policy and intelligence establishment that is pushing in one direction based on perceived U.S. interests, based on the strategic considerations about not alienating allies in the region and outside the region. And so that pushes the U.S. towards this international consensus view, based on UN resolutions, based on international law, broadly based on a just and equitable resolution of the conflict. And then there's a different set of forces that act in the exact opposite direction. Those are rooted in domestic politics, in culture and ideology very often. Many American presidents have a very strong sentimental attachment to the state of Israel, and that informs their policy. Others are responding to pressures from Congress, which itself is responding to pressures from very potent pro-Israel forces. And so that pushes in a different direction. And you end up with presidents who try to fudge between the two or pivot back and forth, but in reality producing a very incoherent U.S. policy.
I want to go back to some of the historic evolution of America's policy towards the Palestinians, because there's so much documentation about the America-Israel relationship. I think one of the contributions of the book is to say, this is the story from the Palestinian point of view. Here's how we were, here's how we encountered the international community. You write that going back as early as the 1920s, and I'm quoting, American politicians were already dismissing Palestinian opposition to the Zionist project as either artificially generated or the product of an irrational hatred of Jews rather than a manifestation of Palestinians' own political aspirations. I thought that was interesting. If we drop the whole irrational hatred part, are the 2 points really mutually exclusive? I mean, could it be that Arab-Palestinian opposition was steadfastly opposed to the existence of a Jewish state and non-negotiable, and also an expression of political aspirations? And I ask that because I think that's exactly the fear of the Israeli right wing, is that Palestinian national self-determination is predicated on there not being a Jewish state. What's your thinking about that, especially in those early years?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly early on, Palestinian opposition to the Zionist project and to the idea of a Jewish national home was perceived by them as existential. This was an existential threat. And we see that over and over again, even in the kind of, limited, but I think important interactions between American officials and Palestinian representatives, who made it clear, look, if we accept this project, it means that either we will be enslaved or we will be expelled. And they would describe the Zionist project in those terms. The Zionist movement was not shy about its goals of creating a Jewish majority in Palestine through immigration, which of course presented the Palestinian Arab majority with a kind of existential threat. And so they were always going to be opposed to the Zionist project because it not only interfered with their own goals of self-determination and independence, but for a lot of them also it meant that their physical presence in Palestine was threatened.
What's interesting is that if you think about what happened between the 1920s and the 1940s, is that from a Palestinian perspective and experience, they could say we were right. We were either made into second class or expelled during the war. So maybe the fears, maybe there's no way around the sense that emerging nationalisms were zero-sum on some level.
It's true. I mean, it certainly, that was how the Zionist movement looked at it, and it's also how the Palestinian national movement looked at the issue in terms of zero sum, right? The first iteration of an autonomous Palestinian national movement in the 50s and 60s were, we have to remove Israel as a project, as an initiative, and we could have perhaps Jews there, but this will be an independent Arab state, perhaps with a Jewish minority.
Right. So let me ask you about that, actually, because in this emerging phase, I guess it's still the pre-state era, you talk about Haj Amin al-Husseini's dilemma of taking a kind of rejectionist approach, like an complete no, we will not accommodate, or an accommodationist approach into pre-state Zionism. And he chose the more rejectionist approach. First of all, is that an accurate characterization? And if so, in hindsight, do you think he was correct? Do you understand it? Is it because of this historical context we just described?
I mean, there is an ongoing debate among the scholars as to what exactly Husseini's position was, the Mufti's position. I think Rashid Khaledi paints a pretty compelling picture of Haj Amin al-Husseini as in some ways a pragmatist, but I think according to Rashid's telling of that history, and he's a historian and I'm not.
And so he's also another proud previous guest of the Tel Aviv Review.
Good, yes, that's great. So in Rashid's telling, the Mufti had a dilemma. He was inclined to accept, for example, the British White Paper of 1939, which almost, it's kind of the first Clinton parameters before the Clinton parameters, at least in terms of the narrative that has emerged. And that is, here is a third party trying to navigate between these two competing communities and these two competing national movements. And they are coming down with their view of a compromise scenario. It met most of the immediate needs and demands of the Palestinian Arabs, to the extent that the Zionist movement completely rejected it. And yet officially, Husseini also rejected it. In part, I think he was inclined to accept it in Rashid's telling, and some of his immediate circle of advisors were also inclined to accept it, but ended up rejecting it because of the pressure from his generals out in the field who had suffered such heavy losses at British hands. The British, of course, had imposed a major crackdown on Palestinian political activism, and so they didn't want to compromise.
Right. And so in hindsight, in the historical sort of, I would say, mainstream understanding of this era, we remember, at least, and I say we, again, I mean sort of a Western-centric, American, certainly Jewish and Israeli perspective, we remember the Palestinian, early Arab leadership in Palestine as rejectionist and as violent. But you also point out that between 1944 and 1947, there was practically a wave of Jewish Zionist terror.
Right.
Including attacking civilians, including attacking political officials. That's terror.
Yeah.
Why did that not have the same impact of discrediting the Zionist movement in the eyes of, we're talking almost always about the relationship with America right now.
Yeah.
Is there a double standard? What happened there? Why was that not something that turned the Zionists into, a bunch of violent rejectionists?
Yeah, I mean, I've always wondered that. At the very same time that there was this spike in Zionist terror by groups like the Stern Gang and Begin's group, the Irgun, at that very same moment, there was, again, it shows this kind of disconnect where the discourse in Washington was was driven by Congress primarily in terms of we need to support Jewish statehood because that's what the Zionist movement was pushing in America. The idea that Zionist terrorists were attacking America's closest ally in the world, Great Britain, didn't factor into the debate at all. At least in terms of the political debate happening in Congress, it was a part of the discussion between British and American officials, and the British made their displeasure known quite directly, and in fact accused the Americans of providing material support to Palestinian terrorists, and almost using that
the Jewish Zionist terrorists,
right? Referring to the Palestinians.
Oh, saying you're encouraging them, so that
right,
encourages Palestinians.
The irony of that formula of providing material support to Palestinian terrorists is something I wanted to highlight in the book because, of course, the term Palestinian in this case referred to the Zionist Jewish community, but because so much of the support for material support including weapons and funds, was coming from the United States for these groups. And so but there weren't the kind of international mechanisms, and, terrorism wasn't a thing the way it is now. So, but there's clearly a discrepancy between how American officials viewed the terrorism phenomenon then as opposed to later on with Palestinian terrorism. There are a lot of factors for that. International terrorism becomes a much bigger phenomenon in the 70s than it is in the 1940s.
Okay, so in this earlier phase, to this day, we have some figures who dispute when the Palestinian national identity emerged in the sense of the Palestinian Arabs in the region. At what point did America, the American government and American presidential administrations come to actually acknowledge that there are Palestinian Arabs, they have national rights, and we need to interact with them?
Not really before the 1970s.
And what
it's really
happened? Why?
In the 1970s, that's the irony, is that violence and terrorism kind of, in a way, put Palestinians on the map.
That was a
politically.
fascinating point because, people often say, well, Israelis only understand force. But maybe what you're saying, when I read that part of it, was that Americans only understood force, and maybe the entire world really only notices actors when they use force. Right.
And that's what I call the kind of the terrorism paradox, because on the one hand, from this Palestinian standpoint, terrorism, these kind of spectacular acts of terrorism, whether it's the Munich Olympic massacre or the airplane hijackings in Amman on the eve of the Jordan PLO civil war in 1970, these were things that grabbed international headlines. It allowed the Palestinians to project their demands internationally. Clearly, it worked on that level. But at the same time, it made Western and especially American policymakers very averse to wanting to deal with them. So on the one hand, they recognize, okay, yes, this is a political force that has to be reckoned with, but at the same time, that makes me less inclined to want to deal with it. So it's a double-edged sword in the sense that it put Palestinians on the political map, but it made people less inclined to want to deal with them.
Okay, but then still at that point, as we reach the 1970s, eventually we have the Camp David negotiations. At the negotiation, there is an attempt to resolve the situation of the Palestinians. Begin talks about autonomy. So there is some sort of recognition there. The question is, what happened during that first Camp David negotiation between the three sides in dealing with the question of Palestinian autonomy? That led to the fact that there was never an agreement.
The three sides being Egypt?
Between Israel, America, and of course the Palestinians weren't part of the Camp David negotiations. But there wasn't. What I'm saying is it seems like that was a legitimization of the idea that there was an issue that needed to be resolved, as opposed to Israel just not dealing with the.
I think Carter, going into that process, very much wanted to bring even the PLO, not just the Palestinians. He certainly wanted to put the Palestinians on the agenda, and he was the first president to say
the
term Palestinian homeland, which was not quite the equivalent of the Balfour Declaration, but it was new because it certainly made them a national and political. Gave the Palestinians a national and political identity that they hadn't had in U.S. politics before. And he even was inclined to bring the PLO into the process. But by this stage, his ability to do that was hamstrung by this 1975 Memorandum of Agreement that was pushed through by Henry Kissinger, in which the U.S. and Israel agreed that the United States would not recognize or negotiate with the PLO until it recognized Israel's right to exist and accepted UN Security Council Resolution 242. What was interesting is that terrorism wasn't one of those conditions. That was added a decade later.
Which says to you that the rejection of the PLO wasn't really involved in terrorism? I mean, I saw that point.
It was. They were involved in terrorism. But what I'm saying is the PLO, the primary drive to keep the PLO out of the political process was not driven by Palestinian involvement in terrorism.
Right, that's what I was
referring to.
Even though
there was PLO involvement in terrorism. There was Munich, there was Black September, there were lots of these incidences, but it wasn't so prominent that it actually became one of the official conditions prohibiting a U.S. PLO dialogue until the mid-1980s. So at this stage, Carter wanted to bring the PLO into the process, but first he would have to convince the PLO leadership to accept UN Resolution 242. That was the biggest obstacle at that time. And so there were third parties that Carter enlisted to try and pursue that discussion since he couldn't talk to them directly. The Saudis, the Egyptians, and other Americans played that kind of intermediary role in talking to the PLO. Once Sadat went to Jerusalem on his surprise visit and indicated that he was prepared to kind of go it alone, that's when the Palestinians basically got cut out of the process, because the prospect of a Egypt-Israel peace treaty kind of overtook everything else.
But you do point out that at the time, because Arafat completely lost trust in the American leadership on this issue, that at that time he also rejected UN Resolution 242 as the basis because he claimed, I don't trust the Americans anymore to lead on this. I want to, start with that as, a way to address this ongoing narrative or claim, which you encounter all the time, that the Palestinians find ways to, not be conciliatory in the negotiations. We can talk about, the partition plan, rejectionism going back to al-Husseini. We can talk about Camp David in 2000, specifically in July 2000, when Arafat did reject the proposal. And I guess the question is thematic. Was there a historic political kind of instinct that we generally say no to these kinds of things because we think we can do better, and that maybe that rejectionism has become entrenched long past its usefulness for achieving Palestinian national goals? Or would you say there's another explanation, and that's that the deals weren't good enough, or some other explanation?
I think it's a combination of things. I think, first and foremost, power dynamics always figure into this process. And so if you imagine in any situation, a more powerful actor, regardless of who it is, has more options at their disposal, right? They are able to impose realities, to dictate outcomes in ways that less powerful actors cannot. And they can kind of absorb the shock of crises better than weaker actors. That's just in general. And so I think going into any negotiation, I think instinctively any weaker party is going to be more risk averse. And so Barak, for example, during Camp David, could go in, be a little bit more bold. He could put the first initiative on the table because Israel held most of the cards. It is an Israeli occupation, right? What few cards the PLO had, they had already kind of played, which was recognition of Israel, buying into 242, buying into the Oslo process. They made most of the big compromises up front. And so it would make sense, I think, for a weaker party to kind of keep their cards closer to their chest, and they're going to be more risk averse. So I think my explanation of the rejectionism, or maybe I would use a more neutral term like reticence of the Palestinian leadership is really grounded in the power dynamics and the kind of natural risk aversion that comes with being the weaker party.
Right. And how can that be resolved? I mean, how can we change the fact that until there is a solution, the Palestinians are the weaker party, but being the weaker party makes it harder to get to a resolution? It sounds like a conundrum.
Yeah, it's a conundrum, and I think it's the role of a mediator to try and address that power disparity and to create a process that incentivizes both sides with the power dynamics in mind to move towards the shared goal of how you resolve this conflict. And so on its face, I would say that will require putting more pressure on the Israeli side because they are the stronger party. They hold most of the cards. They will have to take the initial steps that start the process. If the goal is a two-state solution, well, most of the heavy lifting has to be done on the Israeli side in terms of where you're going, where and how you're going to redeploy Israeli soldiers, how you're going to dismantle settlements. These are big initiatives that have to be undertaken. How to divide Jerusalem. And so from the Palestinian standpoint, it's a question of how can you strengthen them in ways that will make them more inclined to take steps that support the process rather than to become spoilers in the process.
I think that's a very interesting point. What would that look like to strengthen the Palestinian side that is that is unrelated to the pressure that might need to be put on the Israeli side?
Yeah, I mean, I think one lesson that we've learned is that Palestinian internal politics matter. They matter to the success they certainly matter to Palestinians, but they matter also to the success of this diplomatic process with the Israeli side, because there are Palestinian political actors who will act outside of the goals of this process and try to torpedo it. And so those need to be addressed. There are opponents of the peace process on the Palestinian side, just as there are opponents on the Israeli side. On the Israeli side, you have institutional politics, you have elections, you have parties. They can course correct or they can influence the direction of that process through their internal politics, right? So when Israel elects someone like Benjamin Netanyahu in the late 1970s, someone who's opposed to the Oslo process, the Oslo process doesn't
90s,
stop. Yeah. It just has to readapt. It has to adapt to that new reality. In the same way, when Palestinians elected Hamas in 2006, the process should have adapted and said, okay, how can we neutralize the worst elements that this might bring, and at the same time move towards our shared goal of an independent Palestinian state? So you have to accommodate institutional politics on the Palestinian side, because as long as you keep actors like Hamas outside of the process, and they therefore have no stake in its success, that gives them the power to torpedo the process, because they now have a stake in its failure.
So it sounds like if we just put a little pressure on the Israeli side, strengthen and bring up the Palestinian side, and the U.S. overcomes its blind spot to Israeli power and Palestinian politics, we've solved everything.
Well, yeah, I mean, in theory, sure. And these are not easy things, right? There are political obstacles to both of these. And we saw this during the Obama administration. One reason why they couldn't accept something like a Palestinian consensus government that was approved by Hamas was because of opposition from Congress and opposition from the pro-Israel lobby, groups like AIPAC. So there are political obstacles, but at the same time, there are no shortcuts. There is a cost to pay. There is a political cost to pay for moving toward this shared goal of a two-state solution. What has really, I think, hamstrung this process from an American standpoint is the inclination by Americans and Israelis as the two more powerful actors to want to shift as many of those costs and risks onto the Palestinians as possible. Because they could, because they are powerful, and because they have such a close relationship and they can relate to one another. But if you value the goal of the process, then you should be prepared to pay some of those costs, you being the Americans or you being the Israelis. Because it's ultimately, of course, it's easier and more convenient to shift those on to the Palestinians, but there are consequences. And the consequences are you end up with an even weaker Palestinian leadership that is incapable of making the kinds of compromises that we need them to make, because they don't have the internal political backing.
Certainly whatever we've done up until now has not worked, and we all hope that it eventually does. Khaled Elgindy, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks also to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shelem, our producers, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please write us a review. Go to the ratings and review section and then write one. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts and perks. Check out our archive with over 500 interviews. If you like us, please also like us on Facebook. We're called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.